Doctor, assume that on the night of February 3rd, the night prior to Matthew's admission to Children's Hospital, Matthew slept with his mother and brother in the same bed and appeared without symptoms of sickness or injury, healthy and normal.
Excuse me, let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, about the principle. You will hear hypothetical, that is, assumed facts put to the witness. You are to consider them. If you conclude ultimately that the facts as put to the witness are indeed the facts, you may give the witness's opinion what way you wish. If you conclude, or are unable to conclude, let me put it that way, unable to conclude that all the facts are true, then you must give the opinion no weight at all, because it will then be resting on one or more false assumptions. Everyone understand that? Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, please assume that on the night of February 3rd, prior to Matthew's admission to Children's Hospital, Matthew slept with his mother and brother in the same bed and appeared without symptoms of sickness or injury, appeared healthy and normal. Was breastfed by his mother twice the next morning prior to 7:30 and continued to appear healthy and normal. Further assume that during the day on February 4th, Matthew appeared without symptoms of sickness or injury, healthy and normal, and may have cried throughout the day. Further assume that Matthew was fed and ate a half jar of baby food peas, approximately 2 ounces, at 12:30, and other than his crying, appeared without symptoms of sickness or injury, healthy and normal, until approximately 2:45 that day, when at that time he then appeared unresponsive with troubled breathing and eyes rolled back in his head. Doctor, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether the eye, brain, and skull injuries that you observed to be present at Matthew's admission to Children's Hospital on February 4th between 4 and 5 p.m. were present before 8 o'clock that morning?
Yes, I do.
What is your opinion?
That they were not.
Do you have an opinion regarding when, prior to Matthew's admission to Children's Hospital on February 4th, his injuries were inflicted?
Yes, I believe it was but a few hours.
Doctor, given the nature and extent of Matthew's injuries on February 5th and the progression of those injuries as of February 7th, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty regarding Matthew's prognosis at that point?
Yes.
What is your opinion, Doctor?
My opinion is that the prognosis was grim.
And with regard to neurological functions and his physical state?
Yes.
What is your opinion?
There was effectively no neurological function.
As of February 9th of 1997, the day of Matthew's death, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty regarding Matthew's chance at any meaningful recovery or reversal in his condition?
Yes, I do.
What is your opinion, Dr. Newberger?
I believe that the chance of his recovery...
That the word meaningful is rather elastic.
Doctor, as of February 9th of 1997, the day of Matthew's death, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty regarding whether or not there was a chance at a reversal in Matthew's condition at that time?
Yes.
What is your opinion?
I believe that his condition at that time was irreversible.
And given Matthew's injuries and his condition as it worsened from February 4th through February 9th, the day of his death, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty what Matthew's diagnosis was on February 9th?
Yes.
What is your opinion, Doctor?
I believe that on February 9th, this child was brain dead as a result of neurological trauma.
And could you explain what you mean by his condition at that time?
Yes, at the time, on February 9, the child was unresponsive, could not initiate breaths on his own, had no evidence on stimulation of a capacity to withdraw his limbs, much less any capacity for higher order brain function. In the absence of an ability to breathe spontaneously and of other cerebral capacity, in my opinion, this child was clinically dead and was being sustained artificially by life support machinery.
Now, given the fact that Dr. Madsen made an observation which he questioned whether or not was a withdrawal to painful stimuli, given the fact that the baby was able to take a few breaths on its own on February 9th, given the fact that the baby had been on a respirator between February 4th and February 9th, do you have an opinion with regard to whether or not his condition could be reversed or whether it would progressively worsen at that point?
I believe that at that point, this child's condition was certain progressively to worsen and could not have been reversed.
And your opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty what the ultimate result of that condition would be?
Yes.
What is your opinion?
My opinion is that the child would die.
Doctor, given the nature and location of Matthew's injuries, applying your knowledge of the records, your observations you've made of Matthew Eapen, do you attach any significance to the entirety, the distribution, and the totality of the injuries that Matthew was suffering from between February 4th and February 9th of 1997 as they may relate to child abuse?
Yes.
What is your opinion, Dr. Newberger?
My opinion is that all the injuries are attributable to child abuse.
Now, you're certainly familiar with the terms shaken baby and shaken impact syndrome.
Yes.
Shaking impact or shaking impact?
Shaken impact syndrome. And whether or not the difference in a baby's head cavity from an adult's have any significance to that syndrome.
Yes.
And could you explain that, Dr. Newberger?
Yes. A baby's head is disproportionately larger in relation to the rest of its body than our heads are in relationship to theirs. And a 9-month-old who is shaken back and forth has no capacity to control the excursions of his head. The child's brain, further, is immature. It's softer than our brains because the myelin covering of the nerves hasn't yet fully developed. And the brain within the skull, as the brain endures this shaking, bobbles around in the cranial vault. This impacts directly on the brain substance itself. And at the same time, the blood vessels that nourish the vein, that nourish the brain, are susceptible to being sheared as they pass through the dura, the dense lining of the brain. And the combination of these effects in an infant whose head is large, whose brain is plastic, whose brain is going back and forth, is to exert a tremendous amount of pressure on brain cells themselves, and ultimately to cause the death of these cells.
And Doctor, how concomitant trauma affects shaken baby as it relates to shaken impact syndrome?
Concomitant or simultaneous trauma increases the amount of traction force quite massively. And a neurosurgeon, her name is Duhaime, at the University of Pennsylvania, actually fitted out a baby doll with a hinge on the back of the neck and attached to it a transducer in order to measure the amount of traction force on a doll who was shaken and on a doll who was shaken and impelled against a hard object. And what Dr. Duhame found was that the traction forces with the impact were vastly greater than the traction forces with shaking alone. In my experience, in the cases that I see, those cases that include skull fractures also include substantially increased amounts of hemorrhage around and within the brain and damage to the brain substance.
Doctor, considering the range of fatal and non-fatal shaken impact cases that you have experienced, based on the literature in this area, your review of Matthew's medical records and his injuries, Doctor, are you capable of demonstrating for the jury the manner of infliction and degree of force necessary to shake and impact a baby to cause the injuries that you observed to be present in Matthew Weedman?
Yes, I could.
Your Honor, may we be seen briefly at sidebar, please? Could you do that for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury with your hands, please?
Sure. I believe it would have been necessary for this child to be grasped firmly by an adult and for the child to be shaken for a number of seconds with all the force that an adult could mount. And if a child weighs 18 or 19 pounds, that's a pretty heavy child. And it's a fair amount of weight, but it would look something like this. This would be very tiring and would require the maximum amount of force that an adult could muster. It would also require for this child to receive the concomitant occipital fracture as part of one of the intervals of this shaking assault, an impact to be exerted in approximately the following fashion.
Doctor, whether or not during the course of this complex assault you just described, the baby would have to be held free fall. In other words, the entire body of the baby in midair.
No, that would not have been necessary. For example, it would be possible to, for a portion of this, or for the entire assault, for the adult to be over the child, for example, kneeling next to the child with a portion of the child's body on the floor, and with the impact, which would have required, in my opinion, a substantial amount of force exerted differently. The impact would not necessarily have to have been with the child held in the air, but the child could have been lifted and brought down with massive force.
Let the record reflect that the doctor put his hands over his head and then forced it, rapidly descended him towards the ground. Fair enough, Ms. Shaw?
Fair enough. That's exactly what I intend, counsel.
Thank you, Dr. Newberger. I have no further questions of Dr. Newberger at this time. Returning Exhibit 68 to the exhibit today.
Very well. You may cross-examine.
You indicated in your last answer you believe, in this case, that there was both an incident of impact and a period of prolonged, severe, frenzied shaking, right?
I believe that there was at least one impact sufficient to create the skull fracture. There may well have been more in the course of the interval, which may have in the course of the assault been intermittent. In other words, it may not necessarily have been all delivered in the same assaultive pattern and motion. It could have been a process where the child may have, for whatever reason, provoked the person who assaulted the child.
I think it would be best, Doctor, not to use the word assault, which has they use words describing physical activity, but that's not the characterized.
Doctor,
Thank you, Your Honor.
What I'd like to isolate with you and see if we can agree upon this and then discuss them one by one are mechanisms. Are you with me?
Yes.
All right. So, however you hypothesize and these events that you've been describing to the jury, I take it that there are two mechanisms here at issue in terms of your observations. One is that somewhere in the course of what you're telling us you think occurred, there was an impact of the baby's head on a fixed hard surface. There was an impact.
Yes,
right?
there was at least one impact sufficient to fracture the occiput.
All right, and I think that you actually, at the end of your direct examination, gave us a physical demonstration of how you think this impact could well have occurred, where you put your hands over your head and simulated the baby's head being slammed downward. Isn't that what you did?
Yes.
Okay, so there's impact. Then in addition, so we're clear about what you're saying, in addition, you're also maintaining that there must have been a mechanism of severe shaking here, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's discuss first the impact. Isn't it your position that the degree of force, this impact, is on the order of a child falling out of a second-story window onto concrete?
Yes.
No doubt about that in your mind.
If I were to estimate,
So the answer is yes, there's no doubt about that in your mind?
well, please understand, counsel,
Excuse me, Doctor, but I'm going to answer yes or no.
it's the concept of no doubt, Your Honor, that confuses
I'll
me.
withdraw the no doubt. Dr. Smith analogized the velocity of possible impact here as the equivalent of a car hitting a baby carriage. Would you agree with that?
You're asking for opinion of all the witnesses' testimony?
No, stating that it's the equivalent of stating something and asking if the doctor agrees.
Would you agree with that assessment?
I need more information, counsel. How fast would the car going, and where would it be hitting the baby carriage, and where would the baby be?
Right, fair enough. So let's stick with your analysis. You're saying that the degree of force is on the order of a child falling out of a second-story window onto concrete, right?
That's correct.
That's what you told the grand jury in this case?
That is correct.
Isn't that what pretty much you told the police on the morning of February 5th or the afternoon of February 5th after you examined Matthew Eaton? Something...
Well, counsel, when I examined Matthew Eaton, the skull fracture had not yet been identified, and my conversation with the police, if I recall correctly, had nothing to do with the mechanism whereby the skull fracture was obtained.
11:15 you examined Matthew Eaton on February 5th, right?
Yes,
the
that's
note
correct.
you just reviewed.
That's correct.
What I'm talking about is, after the skull films were done, after the skull fracture was discovered, after consultation with Dr. Madsen, there was a time in the afternoon when you had conversations with the police and gave them an assessment of this case.
Yes, there was a meeting subsequent to the child's death.
And-
That is correct.
And that, no, not subsequent to the death, I'm talking about February 5th, prior to the arrest of Louise Woodward. Remember talking to them then?
Yes, but counsel, the skull fracture, if I am not mistaken, was not identified at the time of that conversation.
All right. Now, you examined Matthew Eaton at 11:15 on February 5th.
That's correct.
You found no bruises on his arms.
That is true.
You found no bruises on his shoulders.
Also correct.
You found no bruises on his ribs or chest.
That is correct.
You found no bruises on his abdomen or stomach area.
That is correct.
You found no bruises on his neck.
That is correct.
You found no bruises on his legs.
That is also correct.
All right. And you examined his head.
Yes, I did.
You touched or palpated his scalp.